Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Innistrad Midnight Hunt spoilers, and we have a ton of stuff to talk about today. We got new curses, the return of Gisa, a bunch of sweet flashback stuff, zombies, so many cool cards, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start talking sweet new Innistrad Midnight Hunt cards. Before we do, one super quick reminder. If you want to keep up on all the latest spoilers, you can find them all over at MTGpreviews.com. So anyway, with that out of the way, let's talk Innistrad Midnight Hunt. Need some new Innistrad Midnight Hunt cards? Well, you can pre-order them now from our sponsor Card Kingdom by heading over to cardkingdom.com. So first up today, we got a sweet new green mythic, Consuming Blob. Basically, Blob-a-Goyf, Ooze-a-Goyf, Tarmo-ooze, something along those lines. 5 mana, star +1 for its toughness, power equal number of card types in your graveyard, toughness equal to the number +1, and then on your end step, you make an ooze with those same stats, power equal number of card types in your graveyard, toughness the same +1. So this is essentially a ooze that's a Tarmo-Goyf, although it doesn't count your opponent's graveyard, just your graveyard, but very close to a Tarmo-Goyf, that then makes more Tarmo-Goyf oozes on your end step. I think this card's actually pretty powerful. Like, when you think about what this card does and what it is, it's very similar to Biogenic Ooze. Biogenic Ooze, another 5-drop ooze. It's a 2/2, it makes a 2/2 ooze when it comes into play, and then in your end step, you put a +1/+1 counter on each ooze you control. Of course, you could play Biogenic Ooze in a ooze tribal deck, but we've never had Ooze Tribal in Standard. It was just played as a standalone card, essentially. You just play it and make an ooze, and then later maybe you have 4 mana and you make another ooze, and you slowly grow the oozes. Consuming Blob does essentially the same thing. If you're not playing Ooze Tribal and really like pumping your entire team with Biogenic Oozes +1/+1 counters, it kind of does the same thing, but better. Like, if you can fill your graveyard a bit, which we should be able to do since we're heading to Innistrad, this can easily be like a 4 or 5, conservatively when it comes down, that makes a 4 or 5 every single end step. That's a lot of power and toughness across multiple bodies for the 5 mana investment. So I think this card is probably pretty standard playable. Like, we've seen similar cards that I would argue are a little bit worse see a decent amount of play in the past. So I don't know why Consuming Blob couldn't do the same thing. There's not really that much competition in the green 5-drop slot. We got like Froghemoth, which is powerful and aggressive. Ashaya needs to sit out for a while but can do bonkers things. Battle Mammoth gives you a bit of protection. If it's targeted and killed, you're going to draw a card, so that's something. But Consuming Blob arguably offers the most immediate value out of all of these cards. We've talked about how with so much removal running around, inflexible removal in Standard, you really want threats that do something right away. And sure, you got to get to your end step, but as long as you make it to your end step and your opponent doesn't immediately have instant speed removal, you're getting 2 Consuming Blobs essentially for 1 card, which means even if your opponent kills one of them, they killed a Consuming Blob, you're still going to have a Tarmo-Goyf left over. So I think this card offers a lot of power in Standard, although I do think you got to be able to fill your graveyard to really take advantage of it, at least to some extent. I'm not sure how good this will be if you're not focused on card types at all, not focused on filling your graveyard at all. The good news is, I think we have plenty of ways to do this. Like, surviving rotation, we got stuff like Warlock class, an enchantment that can fill your graveyard with the 2nd level. We got Egon, we got Blacks and Search for Blacks, which can fill your graveyard. So we got good stuff remaining in Standard, and we're going into Innistrad. We've already seen Ren and 6, we've seen Consider, we've seen Join the Dance. Graveyard has always been a theme of Innistrad, so I would be absolutely shocked if we don't keep getting more ways to fill your graveyard, and that could make Consuming Blob into a legitimate top-tier threat in Standard. So I would be surprised if Consuming Blob was not somewhere between Standard playable and even very good in Standard in the right deck. Also, in Commander, probably worth a Ooze Tribal, like making multiple oozes if you're playing like Mimeoplasm Ooze Tribal or Ooze Tribal. There's not that many great oozes. I think Consuming Blob probably going to be one of them, even better in like Mimeoplasm oozes, because Mimeoplasm cares about the graveyard. But I think that Consuming Blob, it's just a solid mythic. It's cool that it references back to Tarmo-Goyf. It's sweet that it's an ooze, and it's just a really good card. So, keep an eye out for this one for Standard. I would not be surprised to see decks playing it. We also got a blue mythic, Stitcher of Dowls, a 3-mana 2/3 human wizard. When you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you make a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decay. Decay, again, we talked about it yesterday, but essentially, the token can't block, and if it attacks, you gotta sacrifice it then to combat. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 3 or more creature tokens, you can transform it into the Dow Factory, which is an artifact that makes all your tokens lose all their abilities, which is really helpful with Decay. Then all of a sudden you have real tokens that can block, they aren't going to sacrifice it then to combat, and they have a base power and toughness of 3/3. So it's essentially like a token anthem that also prevents Decay from being a drawback. And then on your upkeep, if you want to, you can flip back around into Stitcher Dowls, start casting more spells, making more tokens. Going to Dow Factory could even be a way to protect your Stitcher Dowls. Like, you make a few tokens, and then you transform so your opponent can't use creature removal on your Stitcher Dowls. And then after your opponent deals with your tokens or they trade off in combat, then you can flip back around, cast more spells, make more zombies, and then flip back around to Dow Factor again. So I think this card is actually pretty legit. It calls back to Monastery Mentor, Young Pyromancer, more recently Sedgemoor Witch, which is still in standard. These 2 or 3 mana creatures that when you cast a spell are going to give you a token of some kind. Stitcher of Dowls is probably not quite as good as Monastery Mentor. It's 1 more mana than Young Pyromancer, although your tokens are better and you get the Anthem, Flip, Transform upside. Sedgemoor Witch might be a pretty good comparison, and that might be the most exciting because both of these cards are legal in standard. We can now build a standard deck that's 4 Stitcher Dowls, 4 Sedgemoor Witches, a ton of just spell slingery type stuff, Considers and Village Rites to sack the tokens to draw more cards, and Plumb the Forbidden and removal like Flunk and Infernal Grasp, and have that be the plan. Like, I can see the foundation for a blue-black Stitcher of Dowls Sedgemoor Witch Spellslinger deck where you just try to stick 2 or 3 of these, cast a bunch of spells, make a bunch of tokens, flip around into Dow Factory, smash your opponent, and go to town. It seems like it can actually be pretty powerful in standard. As far as older formats, we've seen Monastery Mentor be playable all the way back to Vintage. We've even seen Sedgemoor Witch be playable all the way back to Vintage. Is Stitcher of Dowls in the conversation for these older formats? I would say in general, it's probably a little bit worse than Monastery Mentor. Monastery Mentor, the upside is, because it has prowess and its tokens has prowess, it is often like a 1-turn clock. You play it, you make a bunch of tokens, next turn you cast your Brainstorm and Ponders, all the tokens are like 6 power or something, and you just kill your opponent in 1 attack. So that's the main purpose there. Sedgemoor Witch has the upside of Magecraft. In Vintage, it's often played with like Flusterstorm, so you cast a bunch of spells and then you Flusterstorm, and all those copies make tokens. Stitcher of Dowls, why the upside of turning into Dow Factory is something, and you could even argue it's a little like Monastery Mentor, because you can make tokens and then pump those tokens, and it is worth pointing out that it is making 2/2s. Sedgemoor Witch is making 1/1s, Monastery Mentor technically making 1/1s, although they get big thanks to prowess. So I could see like an argument for this having a shot. It is a blue card, so it pitches to Force the Will. My guess is maybe it's close enough that people try it, but I don't expect it to quite beat out Monastery Mentor and Sedgemoor Witch. As far as Commander is concerned, seems like an easy inclusion in token-based spellslinger decks. If you're playing like Talrand, if you're playing Kiker, these commanders that essentially have ability very much like Stitcher Dowls, where you want to cast a bunch of spells, make a bunch of tokens, and then take advantage of those tokens. Stitcher Dowls seems like a really easy inclusion there. You just play it and then cast all your spells along with your commander and double up all your tokens, and then maybe even flip it around and turn your Kiker spirits into 3/3s or whatever. So I think Stitcher Dowls, it's a sweet card. I am hyped to build the standard deck with it in Sedgemoor Witch. I could see that actually being really powerful in standard. Some potential back in like Modern, Pioneer, Historic, and definitely showing up in Spellslinger decks in Commander. Plus, it's just a really sweet, creepy Innistrad card. We also got the return of Gisa, Gisa Glorious Resurrector. So 4 mana, 4/4 legendary human wizard. If a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, put all creature cards that are exiled with Gisa onto the battlefield under your control. They gain decay. So essentially, kill your opponent's stuff with Gisa out, make it to the upkeep with Gisa on the battlefield, and you get to steal your opponent's stuff. I actually really love this card for a couple of reasons. One is, it's incidental graveyard hate, and we always talk about how commander decks should play more graveyard hate, but no one wants to put a Leyline to the Void or a Tormod script in their deck because it's just not fun. Gisa is fun, and it's also graveyard hate, so it's a way you can trick yourself into doing what you should be doing anyway, which is playing more graveyard hate in your commander decks, and it's just a a fun type of ability. It reminds me a little bit of Endless Whispers, except thankfully it doesn't give your opponents your creatures. Draugr Necromancer, maybe the most recent example, very similar to that, except Necromancer, you actually have to cast the creatures that are exiled. Gisa gives them back to you for free, which is a bit of an upside, except decay, I guess, is the downside. Grave Betrayal is another comparison. Another way to look at Gisa is kind of a fixed, safer, not quite as brutal version of Turgid. We've seen Turgid be kind of miserable in Commander. Like, it's cool, but it gets old really fast. Gisa can do some of the same shenanigans where you're able to steal your opponent's creatures, but it does it in a much less devastating way. Like, Turgid is just like, you make your opponent sacrifice stuff, you get their stuff immediately right then, or discard. You wheel away your opponent's hand, you steal all their creatures. Gisa, you gotta actually kill your opponent's creatures. It doesn't really work with Wraths, because Gisa needs to be on the battlefield on your next upkeep for you to get the cards with it. So it's kind of fixed Turgid, I would say. A Turgid that's not going to immediately make you archenemy at the table. As far as Standard is concerned, I just want to jam them all together, and I think it would be a really fun deck. Is it going to be a good deck if you just play Gisa, Necromancer, and Turgid, and just all the removal and discard possible and try to steal your opponent's stuff and win the game with it? Probably not, but it seems like a really fun way to play a game of Standard. As far as Commander is concerned, there are some shenanigans. The biggest drawback of Gisa, other than the fact that she needs to remain on the battlefield for a turn cycle after you kill stuff to get to your next upkeep to steal the creatures, is the creatures have decay. And while it is awesome that you're stealing the creatures, the fact that they can't block, and the fact that if you attack with them, they're going to go away at the end of combat, even if they don't die during combat, is a pretty big drawback. However, there are some tricks to get around this. A couple of the easiest are Conjurer's Closet and Synod Sanctum. These blink or exile permanents you control. Conjurer's Closet is just on your end step, you exile a creature you control, return it to the battlefield under your control. Synod Sanctum, 2 mana, return target permanent you control from the game, and then you pay 2 and sack it, and return all the stuff that it exiled back to play. This is a trick to get around the decay on the stuff you steal. Let's say you steal something really sweet with Gisa, but you'd prefer to block with it, or you'd like to attack with it more than once. You can go to your end step, blink that thing with Conjurer's Closet, and it's going to come back as a new version, no decay, no drawbacks, just the real creature. Synod Sanctum, kind of the same thing. You can store up a few things that you steal with Gisa and then eventually put them all back into play without decay. It's also kind of cute with end the turn effects, like playing Gisa in the 99 if you're a Becca deck, or playing Sundial the Infinite in your Gisa deck. This doesn't get around decay forever, but it does allow you to attack with your decay creatures and not lose them. You just steal a bunch of stuff with Gisa, attack with all your decaying stuff that you stole, and then with the sacrifice this trigger on the stack at the end of combat, just end the turn, and your stuff's going to stick around, and you can attack with it again the next turn. It does mean you need to play all your stuff in your pre-combat main phase, but really that's not much of a deal breaker. So Gisa, this card's sweet. I'm excited for this card in Standard. I don't think it's going to be like super top tier competitive, but I do think it's going to be fun, and I've loved playing Turgid in Standard, and I've tried to play Necromancer, haven't really got it to work yet, but I want to jam them all together. That seems like such a cool deck, and in Commander, I feel like this is a safer fixed Turgid that probably isn't going to immediately make you archenemy and get you killed first, but it can still do really powerful things, and there's some sweet shenanigans for building around it. So all around, really sweet card coming in Innistrad Midnight Hunt. Next up, we have a new Transforming Curse in Curse of Leeches / Leeching Darkness. So the day side, the front side, Curse of Leeches, 3 mana curse enchantment. So you gotta target a player with it, attach it to a player. In the beginning of enchanted player's upkeep, they lose a life, you gain a life. And then if it flips around tonight, you get a 4/4 life-linking Leech Horror. So Curse of Leeches, it reminds me a little bit of a Cursed Witch, which we got in Shadows over Innistrad, which was also like a creature / a curse. Obviously the mechanics are a little bit different, but even the backside of a Curse Witch, Infectious Curse, same ability. Beginning of enchanted player's upkeep, they lose a life, you gain a life. So you definitely can see the comparison there. A Curse Witch never really saw real play in Standard, and that might be true of Curse of Leeches as well. It's going to be interesting. So on one hand, the front half of Curse of Leeches is kind of meh. Like, the daybound side, you're draining for 1 each turn, which just isn't really that exciting. Sure, there's scenarios where your opponent's at like 1 life and you're just going to get them and win the game, but in general, drain for 1 each turn is not something I'd want to pay 3 mana for. On the other hand, the Nightbound side is actually pretty good. A 4/4 lifelinker for 3. Those stats have made Old Growth Troll, Savage Knuckleblade, Loxodon Smiter into playable cards in various formats. So I think that if you can consistently manipulate the game state to where it's going to be night often and you're going to have this 4/4 lifelinker for 3, then Leeching Darkness is a pretty solid card. If it's mostly going to be stuck on day and you don't have a bunch of ways to flip it back and forth, then I think it's probably not very good. The front side, though, I could see arguments for playing it in some sort of life gain matters. Like, we do have, like, Trelisara in Standard. We got Marauding Blight Priest surviving rotation. So maybe there's some sort of, like, Abzan life gain deck. Like, you gain a life with Curse of Leeches, which triggers your Trelisara to grow it and let you scry, and then you drain again with Marauding Blight Priest. Maybe there's some, like, synergy style deck that could take advantage of the front side. So we'll have to wait and see. Leeching Darkness, definitely a pretty powerful creature. 4/4 lifelink for 3, that is a real threat. On the other hand, Curse of Leeches, man, not super exciting. Plus, I mean, it is a curse, so we'll see how much curse support we get. There's not really any cards existing in Standard that care about curses, but if we get like Curse of Misfortunes or something like that, they could tutor up curses or some other big curse payoffs, that could also make Curse of Leeches go way up in value. We also got a new Orzhov flashback card, Can't Stay Away. So 2 mana sorcery, reanimate a creature with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard, and it gains, if it would die, exile it instead. So you can't reanimate it multiple times because Can't Stay Away has flashback of 5 mana, and this is a card I'm actually pretty excited for. We have seen Unearth be really big in Modern, and even in Legacy to some extent. Of course, Unearth, 1 mana to do what Can't Stay Away does. So you're trading up 1 mana for a 3 mana creature. Can't Stay Away, though, you're still trading up. You're getting back a 3 mana creature for 2 mana. We do kind of have this in Historic with Revival Revenge, although Revival Revenge, I think, has less upside because the Revenge side just really isn't relevant and it's 6 mana. I would much rather have the flashback option of Can't Stay Away than have the 6 mana Revenge, double your life total upside. So I think that Can't Stay Away, the first thing I thought of, as the art suggests, this seems like a card built for lure stacks in formats like Historic and Pioneer. And once you get to Modern, you got Unearth, so you don't really need Can't Stay Away, although maybe the flashback gives it some chance to show up there. But what I'm picturing is you play your Lurrus deck, and some of those decks are already playing like Claim to Fames and Faithless Lootings and Stitcher Supplier. They're all about getting things in and out of the graveyard, so you don't even really have to draw Can't Stay Away. Much like Claim to Fame, you just want to mill it over, and then later in the game you get your Lurrus and you play your Lurrus and your opponent kills it, and you're like, alright, guess what? I can't stay away in my graveyard. I'll just flash that back, get back my Lurrus again. The only drawback is, if you do go with this plan, and then your opponent kills Lurrus a second time, it is going to get exiled, so you can't keep looping the same creature over and over. But I think this card definitely has potential. Even though the flashback is 5, that's not unreasonable. It's not efficient, but considering that you can cast it early and get back a Stitcher Supplier or something, and then cast it later to get back your Lurrus with its flashback, that's a really powerful effect. As far as Standard, I think it's got a shot there as well. There are decks where this can get back some of the best creatures. We have like Orzhov Angel style decks where this is getting back your Righteous Valkyrie, probably your most important piece. Or we have Sacrifice decks with Eye Twitch and Skullport Merchant. And getting back an Eye Twitch might not sound like much, but that's still a creature. Skullport Merchant for more card draw. Kaelin, maybe there's some sort of Pyre of Heroes Cleric deck that can take off, and you're sacking your clerics and then using Can't Stay Away to get back this clerics that you sacrificed at a discount. So Can't Stay Away, it's a pretty powerful effect. It's not quite Unearth good, but thanks to Flashback, it is a really good card that I expect could see Standard play and definitely has a lot of Historic potential, where Historic has decks that are already ready built for this effect, essentially. We also got a Selesnya flashback card, Rite of Harmony, a 2-mana Selesnya instant that says, whenever a creature or enchantment enters the battlefield under your control this turn, draw a card, and you can flash it back for 4. So Rite of Harmony compares to 2 things. First, we had Glimpse of Nature. Glimpse of Nature, 1 green mana, whenever you play a creature spell this turn, draw a card. Glimpse of Nature is so good that it's banned in Modern, although I think there's an argument that it could be unbanned, at least test unbanned to see what happens, mostly because it's bonkers in combo elf style decks. So you play this, maybe a couple of copies of this, and then you just play your entire deck, essentially. We've also had Beck Call. Beck Call, the back half is literally the same text as Rite of Harmony. It is a sorcery, which mostly doesn't matter. In Beck Call, has proven to be a lot worse than Glimpse of Nature. We haven't really seen Beck Call combo elves be a thing. So I think Rite of Harmony, it's somewhere in the middle. I think it's better than Beck Call for a couple of reasons. Not as good as Glimpse of Nature. Is that enough to make Rite of Harmony playable in various formats? Let's start with the enchantment part, because that's like one of the weird twists. I don't think the enchantment part is a super huge deal, mostly because if you're playing Enchantress in any non-standard format, you have good Enchantresses, things like Sethis and Setessan Champion and Enchantress's Presence. And if you gotta choose between this, like, one shot for one turn, get to draw an extra card whenever I play an enchantment, I think you would rather just have a permanent version of that effect with an Enchantress, although there are some shenanigans here. Imagine, like, Rite of Harmony with a graveyard full of enchantments and then replenish or Resurgent Belief or open the vaults and you just, like, draw your entire deck and go off. So there could be shenanigans with some sort of mass reanimation effect, because most Enchantresses trigger when you cast an enchantment spell. Setessan Champion is different, but Sethis, Enchantress Presence, they trigger when you cast it, which is often an upside, because even if your opponent counters it, you're still going to get the card draw. Rite of Harmony triggers when it comes into play, which does mean it works with these mass reanimation effects. So that's something to keep in mind in your Commander decks or in your Pioneer decks or whatever. But in general, I don't think you're playing this to work with enchantments, typically. On the other hand, it is interesting with creatures. We talked before about how Glimpse of Nature kind of busted in combo elves with Heritage Druid providing the mana and you just go through your entire deck, but Beck Call not being good enough. Will Rite of Harmony change that? My guess is no. Like, the only real difference in a deck like combo elves, which is playing at sorcery speed, is Rite of Harmony has white mana instead of blue mana. In formats like Legacy or Modern, you can splash pretty much whatever you want, so I think it's just the effect isn't quite good enough at 2 mana for decks in older formats. On the other hand, there are certainly uses of this. There's this like meme Legacy deck where you just try to play all the Kobolds possible, Crookshank Kobold, Rogak, Crimson Kobold, just any 0 mana creature. You play Glimpse of Nature, you start chaining together 0 mana creatures, you play very few lands in your decks, eventually you draw Lotus Petals and use those to like kick a Bushwhacker and give all your Kobolds haste and win. I could see Rite of Harmony being a backup Glimpse of Nature, a couple of copies there. The most important thing I think about Rite of Harmony is it is way better than Beck Call in Commander. In Commander, Beck Call has some color issues. I mean, technically it's a Bant card, which is just a tough color combination for the decks that would want this. Rite of Harmony is especially powerful in token decks, because remember, it triggers from creatures coming into play, also enchantments, but creatures coming into play not casting them, which means you can play Reese the Redeemed, or Maja, Tristani Discordant, these powerful token commanders, play Rite of Harmony and like activate your Reese, and just make a million tokens and draw a million cards. So there's many more shenanigans here, and Bant tokens isn't much of a thing in Commander. That's a hard color combination for tokens, but green-white tokens or Selesnya tokens, that's one of the best token colors in the format. So I'm imagining token decks playing this and like White Sun Zenith or March of the Multitudes and just draw 7 cards and refill my hand and make a huge board. That is a huge deal for token decks in Commander. So at a minimum, I think this is going to be a great Commander card in token decks, and maybe we can do the same thing in Standard. Like, we got Starnheim Unleashed, we got Battle for Bertigard, we got Scoot Swarm. That's probably my favorite. Play this with a Scoot Swarm out, play some lands, make copies of Scoot Swarm, maybe play some extra lands somehow, and just essentially draw your entire deck as you make this massive board of Scoot Swarms. Sounds absolutely hilarious. Probably my favorite way to kill myself, by drawing my entire deck in Standard. So Rite of Harmony, I really like this card. I think it's going to be great in Commander token decks. I think it's got some at least janky fun Standard potential, and who knows, maybe one of the decks in older formats will make use of it, although the fact that Beck Call hasn't really taken off and it's existed for a long time does make me slightly skeptical about how good it's going to be in like Legacy or Modern or whatever. But still, Rite of Harmony, very powerful flashback card. We also got Geistflame Reservoir, a interesting new artifact. So 3 mana red artifact. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, put a charge counter on it. You can pay 2 tap it, remove any number of charge counters to deal that much damage to any target, or pay 2 tap it, exile the top card of your library. You can play it this turn. So card advantage and eventually damage that you're storing up for the late game. This card reminds me a little bit of Firemind's Research. Firemind's Research was kind of the is it enchantment version of this. Same type of setup where it gets counters when you cast instant or sorceries, and it generates card advantage, and it's able to deal a bunch of damage. Firemind's Research, it did see a bit of like sideboard play and control decks, but was never a huge staple in Standard. You can also see an argument of Geistflame Reservoir kind of being like a Grape Shot sorta, or an Aetherflux Reservoir, where if you can cast 20 instant or sorcery spells with it on the battlefield, you're going to get 20 charge counters that for 2 mana you can remove and just kill your opponent on the spot with 20 damage, which is kind of similar to Grape Shot, except you need it on the battlefield first, and it's only limited to instants and sorceries. However, I'm actually really skeptical of cards like this these days. One thing that we've seen recently is Wizards putting a ton of really flexible removal. I'm thinking like Prismari Command, Vanishing Verse, Skyclave Apparition. These are cards that just incidentally happen to do with Geistflame Reservoir, and because they have so much flexibility, they show up in main decks. These are some of the most popular removal spells in Standard 2022, which is our best approximation so far of post-rotation Standard. So I'm expecting that these cards are going to show up a lot in decks, so it's unlikely that you're going to be able to play Geistflame Reservoir and just have it sit out on the battlefield for like 3, 4, 5, 6 turns. If it starts to get scary, your opponent probably going to have an answer incidentally in their main deck. A few years ago, we used to talk about like, oh, it's an artifact, and people don't usually have main deck artifact removal, so you're kind of safe. Like, if you can resolve it, it's probably going to stick for a while. That is no longer the case. With all this flexible main deck removal that's running around in Standard, maybe you could play it in a Spellslinger Commander deck. I don't know if it'll make the cut or not. I can see a argument for it, maybe, although, again, there's a lot of other options available. There's a ton of Spellslinger cards these days. So Geistflame Reservoir, it's a fun card, probably a cool challenge card for Limited, but I'd be kind of surprised if it actually made it in Constructed, just because so many decks can kill an artifact in their main deck these days. We also got a sweet new curse, Curse of Shaken Faith. So 1 and a red, it's a curse. You enchant a player, and whenever enchanted player casts a spell other than the first spell they cast each turn, or when they copy a spell, it deals 2 damage to them. So Curse of Shaken Faith, this is actually a pretty interesting card. So in Standard, I think this is designed to be a safety valve against Magecraft, essentially. If the like Plumb the Forbidden Sedgemoor Witch combo style decks, or clever Lubomancer Magecraft copying aggro style decks become too popular, this could be a good sideboard card for those decks. I think it might have some potential in older formats as well. Like, it hates on things like Storm. To a lesser extent, it hates on Phoenix style decks. They got to cast 3 spells in a turn, so you're getting, what, 4 damage at least if your opponent's getting back their Phoenix, or even Lava Dart style Prowess decks cast a lot of spells in a turn. This is going to slow them down, or at least make your opponent take a lot of damage. And one of the biggest upside to this card by far is it's not symmetrical. There are many other good options in a format like Modern to hate on Storm style combo decks. Like Red has Eidolon of the Great Revel. You have Damping Sphere as a colorless option. However, these cards are symmetrical. So let's say you're playing Storm, but you're worried about losing the Storm Mirror. You can't really play Eidolon because it's going to kill you too often. Same with Damping Sphere. It shuts down your deck. Curse of the Shaken Faith is an interesting option for combo decks to fight the combo Mirror because it only hits on the person that you curse, so it's only going to hit on your opponent. On the other hand, in a generic deck where it doesn't matter, I kind of feel like Curse of Shaken Faith is probably worse than Eidolon of Great Revels. Like, I guess Eidolon is a creature, so it's more likely to die than Curse of Shaken Faith, but it also hits on more. If you're playing a deck like Burn or something, I think I'd rather just be hitting on any spell with mana value 3 or less than on the second, third, fourth, or copies of spells that the opponent casts during a turn. But I do think there's potential in older formats. I think another place this is kind of exciting is in Historic. Historic doesn't have all the hate card options that formats like Modern and Legacy do. So this becomes much more exciting. There's no Eidolon of Great Revel that you can just choose to play in Historic. In Historic, it keeps getting more Storm cards. There's Citadel decks. There's Arclight Phoenix decks. So Curse of Shaken Faith could end up being a sideboard all-star there if these combo cast a bunch of spells in a turn decks become a big thing in the format. And if you go further back to Legacy, there are curse decks. Like, that is an actual thing that exists. And while I don't think this is going to be one of your primary curses, I certainly think if you're playing Curse of Misfortunes and playing a curse deck and you can tutor this up, this is definitely at least worth sideboard slots to win against Storm and other big turn combo decks. So Curse of Shaken Faith, pretty solid hate card. It is powerful because it's a curse and it's not symmetrical. That is the biggest upside. I think discounting that, there's other cards that are roughly as powerful or probably even more powerful as hate. But when you consider that not every deck can play those because you might be hating on yourself as well, there's certainly a role for Curse of Shaken Faith from formats like Standard all the way back to possibly Legacy and Curse style decks. In the world of lower rarity cards and reprints, we got some interesting, although not high value reprints. Thermo-Alchemist making its return, a pretty good burn card. Sees a lot of play in Pauper Burn, occasionally shows up in other burn decks. Interesting with all this Spell Slinger Strixhaven stuff, so maybe we'll see some sort of aggressive pinging burn deck in Standard. Dissipate tends to come around with Innistrad thanks to the graveyard theme. In general, it's not a super crazy counter spell. It just counters something for 3 mana. That's a cancel, except exiling it is relevant in a world of flashback spells, graveyard decks, so we'll have to see. If flashback is heavily played, Dissipate's gonna go up in value. Clear shot, mostly limited only stuff. Finally, as far as commons and uncommons, a bunch of stuff to fill out your limited deck. Foul Play could be an okay constructed removal spell. 2 mana sorcery, destroy target creature power 2 or less, and get a clue out of the deal. Get to investigate. So it could be a sideboard option against aggro, perhaps. Ominous Roost looks fun for some sort of flashback deck, giving you a 1/1 bird token whenever you cast a spell from your graveyard or when it enters the battlefield. Although, unfortunately, those birds can only block other creatures with flying, so not very good on defense in most cases. A bunch of zombies that don't look super powerful, but could fill out the 1-drop, 2-drop slot on the zombie curve in constructed. And then we have our lower rarity transform cards. Some interesting werewolves, mostly for commander. I don't think they're going to make it in Standard, but like Village Watch, 5 mana, 4/3 haste on the daybound side, but nightbound, it gives all your wolves and werewolves haste. I could certainly imagine playing that in a werewolf commander deck. Bladebane Scoundrel of note, since it's the first, I believe, black werewolf we've ever seen. Flame Channeler could also work in that burn deck with Thermo-Alchemist, 2 mana, 2/2, but when you deal damage with a spell, you get to flip it into a 3/3 that when you deal damage with a spell gets counters, and then you pay 1 and remove the counters to exile the top card of your library and cast them this turn. So some interesting transform stuff, and I believe that brings us to the end of our daily Innistrad Midnight Hunt spoilers for today. So let me know what you think about all these crazy new cards. What from today are you most excited about? Let me know in the comments. And like usual, if you want to see all the latest spoilers throughout the day until the next video goes up, you can find them all over at mtgpreviews.com. So thanks everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll be back tomorrow with more daily Innistrad Midnight Hunt spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, everyone, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more spoiler coverage? Well, make sure to check out yesterday's video where we got to talk about a ton of sweet new stuff, including the new Arlen and more.